Welcome to the online class lecture. Welcome to the online class lecture. Class lecture note of Professor S.K. Paul, HOD, University Department of English, BRA, Bihar University, Muzaffarpur. Dear students of PG Semester 3, CC 13, Unit 5, good afternoon to all of you. Today, I am going to discuss some aspects of from Indian poetry. The topic is characteristics of Indian poetry in English. Indian poetry has a full and ancient past. Uh, uh, mm, During the last 4,000 years, it was written in the languages belonging to both the major linguistic groups, the Indo-Aryan and the Indo-Dravidian. Indian poetry in Sanskrit and its popular forms flourished primarily from the middle of the second millennium BC to AD 1000. During the 1000 years, Indian poetry was written in most of the Indo-Aryan and the Indo-Dravidian languages, including Assamese, Bengali, Gujarati, Hindi, Kashmiri, Tamil, Telugu, and Urdu. The growth of Indian poetry in English was a direct result of the British influence and rule of India. Early Indian poetry in English was a borrowed plume in every possible way, right from syntax to sentiments. Everything was so imitative that it looked a perfect alien bride, both in its inspiration and guidance. It depended on England. Even the imagination was slavish. The nature, quality, expanse, and dimensions and dimensions of both mind and imagination depend upon the freedom linguistic elasticity offers the users. Attempts to keep the rigidities of British syntax, word use, phrase making, and melody have either improvised poetry in English or made it as complex and abstract as follows. The aging chemist in his drawing room, terse, gentle, the sea like subsides in the night, seen from the ship, the moon, leprous, inverse, rising the girl at Hanoi with her white hands and dog's ears dripping with amber light. Have these things shaped me for the craft of verse? Do they remain, giving a sad insight? And have I changed for better or for worse? Yet another reason for the poverty and monotony of Indian poetry in English was the monopoly of its practice by elites placed either in a few metropolises or educated abroad. The publishing industry, which also got localized in this metropolis, felt overawed by this elite class of poets and refused to patronize others. It is only the writer's workshop which respected the urgencies of expression of the common man. Indian poetry in English has since found its roots in the rural areas, and many of genuine feelings override the restraints and constraints of a medium calling for nativization. More poetry in English has now poured forth from a variety of people representing the life and the spirit of this land. This secularization has obviously led to the remolding of English to the native needs of expression termed as Indianization. The term Indianization of English is generally used in the pejorative sense without understanding the dynamics of linguistic change of this medium in the country. We cannot both use English in Indian context and yet keep its British cultural antecedents and linguistic sanctities. Objections to this process of acculturation of English come from those pedagogues who are either suffering from colonial chauvinism or academic purism. But aside of these reservations, English in India has continued to serve its changed context remarkably well. Though the Indian novelists in English have accelerated the process of desired linguistic deviation, it is the Indian poets, it is the Indian poets in English who have stabilized the naturalization of English to native hues. Braj B. Kachru errs when he opines this process as linguistic and cultural characteristics transferred to an adopted alien language. In fact, it should be rightly described as naturalization of a language wherein it does not act alien. It is only when the stereotypes of languages, word use, and collocation, phrase, and image making are dismantled that the medium can be made amenable and reconstructed to house the native feel of life. English, when separated from the rigidity of its British usage, rightly becomes neutral to develop. As an independent dialect, as in the case of the Caribbean, the West African, and South African, and South Asian. The wider is the dissociation of language from its socio-cultural and geographical political roots. The greater is its freedom to serve the new user. The ever increasing number of Indian English poets has led to a definitive growth of English as Indian. The exercise of the personal and the private in the form has led to a sizable naturalization of English to the feel of the local hand, men and events kept in the country. English, in this process of transformation, has undergone some mutilation of its traditional grammar, syntax, and usage. Hence, the Indianization of English is a historical corollary, and it must be understood and accepted as such. The increased use of Indian landscape and the dissociation from Christmas trees, lilies, daffodils, dells, and nightingales have changed the texture of English in its usage for creative purposes. Consequently, there is a shift in the import and suggestiveness of the language, facilitating ease in taking liberties with the British bound norms and forms of making inflections, compounds and phrases, and patterns of making images and sentences to suit the Indian ethos and imagination. The faddists generally charge Indian English poets of not creating but importing translations of their native thought and feel structures, and consequently the corresponding linguistic patterns in English, not knowing the urgency and purpose of manipulating a foreign medium to our purpose and use. English itself in England has undergone this process of enrichment from French borrowings. Bloomfield is of opinion that expressions like a marriage of convenience, it goes without saying, or I have told him I do not know how many times, are word for word imitations of French phrases. Here the Indian has the advantage of being both French and British, and lender and borrower in one. And this acceptance, accumulation, and naturalization of English as a medium of expression is obviously going to be on his own terms, rather than on the terms dictated by colonial strategies. English cannot be Indian unless its British identity is tampered with. Not that it has to be done deliberately. It is happening in a natural course of its use and usage in the country. Its dialectical variations have multiplied according to the field and field in which it has been used in different geographic, cultural, and socio-professional contexts in the country. No two English spoken in our country are of the same frame, order, register, and texture. Narrowing down the generalizations of English in India to that of the variety used and practiced by the poets, we find that most of the Indian poets in English come from the educated class, whereby the parameters of its criticism and analysis are likely to be less controversial. Further, the shift of poetry as medium of expression from the westernized urban elite to the native has given English sufficient ground not merely for cleansing its British affectations and associations, but also for naturalization it to Indian sensibilities. No deliberate attempt to Indianize English would succeed in taming English to our respective needs unless it is decolonized through a gradual and a wider usage. In life, in lifestyles common to the local contexts in general. The African English is the most admirable model to learn from in this direction. Indian English poetry over the past 250 years departs from any stylized representation of reality of the Indian life and scene, or any stylistic experimentation with language to assert national identity. Instead, it makes conscious use of language, thereby making language more malleable to change with ease and naturalness. The features of change in this form can be observed in the areas of using words with shades of meaning not attributed to it before, compounding, phrase making, transfer of idioms, lexis, collocations, appellations, use of prepositions, change in morphological features, coinage, syntax, assimilation of Indian words and myths, and above all in image making. The excessive use of the spiritual, transcendental, and metaphysical mode has also affected the tone and texture of this poetry. Besides, one could also note the continued use of polite diction and Latinity in this poetry. Generally, there is a scaling down of high seriousness to simplicity and human concerns. There is no strict classification or movements among poets in this regard. The poets exhibit these changes and characteristics of change in entirety or in parts in their own ways. The ever increasing poets from the non elite and non urban tribe have led to the right naturalization of English to the Indian milieu and ethos, though the jingoism of aesthetic slavery to colonial rule in academic criticism may pick holes in the very credentials of the expressive medium and form poetry. The current of changes cannot be denied or averted, as witnessed in the Gallicization and Africanization of English in Ireland and Africa. While there were strong political overtones to and behind this change in these countries, fortunately or unfortunately, there is no such political fervor behind the change in India more than Douglas Hyde, Brandon Behan, and Singe. It is Chinua Achebe, Gabriel Okara, and Thomas Tutula who come closest to our situation and provide a parallel to this change in open affirmation of the fact that no Indian should accept the British modes and models of English if he is to use it as a medium of his expression in the country. Therefore, the changed contexts of landscape, culture, and linguistic annodes and patterns not only alienate the language from its roots but also force it to put on the local color, texture, usage, form, and function. There are three questions that come to the fore when discussing about Indian poetry of English. Is Indian verse in English only sometimes Indian and occasionally poetry? Must Indian poetry in English be Indian before it can be poetry? Is in what exactly lies the Indianness of Indian poetry in English? To begin with the first question, is Indian verse in English only sometimes Indian and occasionally poetry? The second part of this question is easily answered. All Indian verse in English produced during the last 2 centuries from Henry de Rosio to the present day does not automatically qualify as genuine poetry. As a recent anthologist puts it, publication in the field of Indo-Anglian poetry has been ample and indiscriminate for every reckonable book of Indo-Anglian poems I have probably read 10 that need not have been read at all. All they may be Indo-Anglian, but they are not poetry. We might agree some Indian verse in English is only occasionally poetry, mostly because it is very much a poetry of occasion. Most of the numerous sonnets and verses celebrating the motherland and the illustrious leader Sarojini Naidu's to India and the Lotus, Humayun Kabir's Mahatma, V.N. Bhushan's 9th August 1942, and R.R. Shrestha's A Light Onto Our Path are cases in point. Khalid in random, conventional sentiment couched in conventional diction and imagery can hardly rise to the level of genuine poetry. In trying to find a satisfactory answer to the first part of the question, uh, for example, is Indian verse in English only sometimes Indian? One is on comparatively safe ground in spotting obvious imitations, obvious imitations, which has made an uncomfortably large part of this writing a whispering gallery of echoes rather than a chorus of authentic voices. Thoreau wrote in Walden, "The head monkey at Paris puts on a traveler's cap, and all the monkeys in America do the same." The history of Indian poetry in English shows a similar process at work. When the head monkey in London puts on a new literary thinking cap, all the descendants of Sri Hanumanji in India dutifully do the same. Kashi Prasad Ghosh's Shire in the Shire and other poems was obviously an Indian avatar of Sir Walter Scott's minstrel in The Lady of the Last Minstrel. The romantic sun indeed continued to shine in India long after it had ceased to shed on Britons the light the light that never was on sea or land, because literary geography inevitably implies a time lag similar to the one which physical geography presents. After Victorianism succeeded Romanticism in Britain, in due course, Tennysonian and Swinburnian melodies. Some of Harindranath Chattopadhyay's lyrics are typical examples, and Arnoldian music. One recalls Gordon Bottomley's well-known description of Indian poetry in English as Matthew Arnold in a sari became the models to be aped. Modernism arrived after independence, again with the inevitable time lag more than a generation after it had entered Britain. Indian poetry in English is thus only occasionally poetry and only sometimes poetry. This leads to another strain of thought there. Why must Indian poetry in English be always Indian to establish a nationality? Henry Wadsworth Longfellow is reported to have said in connection with the novel Kavanagh, nationality in literature is good, but universality is better. Please mark this line. Nationality in literature is good, but universality is better. Longfellow's statement leads to a similar plea. Why insist that the Indian poet must talk of banyan and the champak and not of cedars and wisterias, of parrots and water buffaloes, and not of red breasts and unicorns, of mangoes and guavas, and not of pears and peaches. Indian poetry has a full and ancient past. During the last 4,000 years, it was written in the languages belonging to both the major linguistic groups, the Indo-Aryan and the Indo-Dravidian. Indo-poetry in Sanskrit and its popular forms flourished primarily from the middle of the second millennium BC to AD 1000. The growth of Indian poetry in English was direct result of the British influence and rule of India. Early Indian poetry in English was a borrowed plume in every possible way. Right from syntax to sentiments, everything was so imitative that it looked a perfect alien pride both in its inspiration and guidance. Guidance it depended on England, even the imagination was slavish. The increased use of Indian landscape and the dissociation from Christmas trees, lilies, daffodils, dells, and nightingales have changed the texture of English in its usage, in its usage, usage for creative purpose. Consequently, there is a shift in the import and suggestiveness of the language, facilitating ease in taking liberties with the British bound norms and forms of making inflections, compounds and phrases and patterns of making images and sentences to suit the Indian ethos and imagination. Narrowing down the generalization of English in India to that of the variety used and practiced by the poets, we find that the most of the Indian poets in English come from the educated class, whereby the parameters of its criticism and analysis are likely to be less controversial. Further, the shift of poetry as medium of expression from the westernized urban elite to the native has given English sufficient ground not merely for cleansing its British affectations and association, but also for naturalization into Indian sensibilities. No deliberate attempt to Indianize English would succeed in taming English to our respective needs unless it is decolonized through a gradual and wider usage in its lifestyles common to the local contexts in the general. The African English is the most admirable model to learn from in this direction. Indian English poetry over the past 250 years departs from any stylized representation of reality of the Indian life and scene, or any stylistic experimentation with language to assert national identity. Instead, it makes conscious use of language, thereby making language more malleable to change with ease and naturalness. The features of change in this form can be observed in the areas of using words with shades of meaning not attributed to it before, compounding phrase making, transfer of idioms, lexis, collocations, appellations, use of prepositions, change in morphological figures, coinage, syntax, assimilation of Indian words and myths, and above all in the image making. In trying to find a satisfactory answer to the first part of the question, is Indian verse in English only sometimes Indian? One is on comparatively safe ground in spotting obvious imitations, which has made an uncomfortably large part of this writing a whispering gallery of echoes rather than a chorus of authentic voices. When Indians first began to write poetry in English, they were outnumbered by Eurasians and Englishmen who also wrote poetry on Indian subjects. Hence, poetry by Indians was not distinguished from poetry by non-Indians. Indeed, both types are published by the same publishers, the Indian subsidiaries of British publishers such as Longman or Hindman, or by the English newspapers and magazines of India, which are usually owned and edited by Eurasians or Englishmen. Most Indian English poets were were educated by Englishmen in Anglophone schools. Like other English poets, they studied English literature because India was a part of the British Empire. Indian English poets did not have a strong national identity, and their early efforts were considered to be a tributary of the mainstream of English literature. Anglo-Indian literature was the term used to denote their poetry, the implication being that this was English literature with Indian themes. The term referred primarily to the literature produced by Englishmen and Eurasians in India, though it also included work by native Indians. The first scholarly work on Anglo-Indian literature was Edward Fairleigh Oaten's A Sketch of Anglo-Indian Literature, published in 1908, a condensed version of which was included in the Cambridge History of English Literature from 1907 to 1914, edited by A.C. Ward. Oaten's primary concern was with English writers such as Jones, Sir Edwin Arnold, and Rudyard Kipling, and Oaten made only passing references to Indian writers in English. With India's independence from Britain and the withdrawal of the British from India, Anglo-Indian literature, defined as literature written by Englishmen in India, more or less came to an end. On the other hand, literature by Indians in English increased gradually, evolving an indigenous tradition for itself. Consequently, Oaten's approach became untenable in dealing satisfactorily with Indian English literature. Nevertheless, it continues to have a few adherents, among them George Sampson, who, in the concise Cambridge History of English Literature in 1970, contends that Indian English literature is a tributary of mainstream English literature. Another approach initiated by the scholars in England in the early 1960s is to consider Indian English literature as a part of Commonwealth literature, or the literature of former British colonies and dominions such as Canada, Australia, the West Indies, and countries in Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. The Journal of Commonwealth Literature, based at the University of Leeds, has done much to foster such an approach. Later, academics in the United States attempted to see Indian English poetry as a part of global literature in English. The journal West Commonwealth Literature, WLWE, World Literatures Written in English, represents this approach. These approaches are fairly useful when the focus is large and the scholar is located in the United States or the United Kingdom. But they share the problem that the literatures of the various nationalities have little in common and often belong to different traditions. Different traditions, for example, Nigerian English literature and Australian literature, nor does such an approach serve very well when one literature, such as Indian English poetry, is studied in depth. It then becomes clear that levels such as Commonwealth literature or world literature in English simply help to provide a forum for these literatures in Western academia, and that detailed study is still pursued by nationality. The most widely accepted approach to Indian English poetry is to regard it as a part of Indian literature. This approach might seem the obvious one, but it took nearly a century to gain wide acceptance. So this way my lecture is over. I have completed my lecture. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, dear students. All of you, thank you. Thank you.